The giant's solitude. The ranch stretched across the dry prairie like a forgotten ocean. Miles of rolling grassland, barbed wire fences sagging under the weight of years, and a weather-beaten house that leaned just slightly into the western winds. It all belonged to one man. Folks in town called him the Giant of Hollow Creek, though not one of them could say they truly knew him. His name was Caleb Boone. Caleb was a man who cast a long shadow. He stood a full head taller than most, broad as a barn door, with hands that could snap a fence post in two if he wasn't careful. His beard grew thick and black, flecked with the silver of early middle age, and his voice was so deep that even a single word seemed to rumble like thunder across the valley. To children, he was a figure from fairy tales, a giant hiding in the hills. To grown men, he was a man best left alone. And that was just how Caleb preferred it. For 10 long years, he'd lived alone on the Boone Ranch, tending cattle, repairing fences, and riding the same trail day after day. His father had died early, his mother passed not long after, and his brother had gone off east to chase business ventures Caleb never understood. By the time he was 30, Caleb was the last Boone left on Hollow Creek, and solitude had hardened into a second skin. The people of Millstone, the nearest town, whispered stories about him. Some said he'd killed a man with his bare hands in a bar fight years ago. Others swore he'd buried treasure somewhere on the ranch and kept away company to protect it. The truth was simpler. Caleb had been hurt once, deeply, by a woman who promised forever and gave him nothing but an empty ring box when she left. After that, he stopped speaking much, stopped seeking warmth, and shut the door of his heart as tightly as the heavy oak door of his ranch house. That door was where it all began. The morning. The morning broke pale and gray, the sky swollen with the memory of last night's storm. Rain still dripped from the eaves, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine carried down from the ridges. Caleb stirred in his bed before dawn, as he always did. The cattle didn't wait for the sun, and neither did he. He rolled from his cot, stretched his massive arms, and lit the stove with a practiced flick of the match. The house was quiet, save for the creak of the timbers in the wind. He brewed coffee, black as tar, and stared out the narrow window at the mist creeping low across the fields. Then came the sound. A faint knock, hesitant, almost lost in the sigh of the wind. Caleb frowned. Nobody came up Hollow Creek Road this early, and certainly not to his porch. He set down the coffee, pulled on his boots, and strode to the door. When he opened it, the world shifted. The 3 sisters. On the porch, huddled together beneath a threadbare quilt, sat 3 girls. The eldest looked to be around 19. She had chestnut-brown hair plastered damp against her cheeks, eyes sharp and unyielding despite the exhaustion written all over her face. She was clutching the younger 2 close, one arm braced protectively around them like a mother wolf. The middle one might have been 16, wiry and restless even in her weariness. Her hair was darker, almost black, and she stared up at Caleb with a mixture of suspicion and mischief, as though she was daring him to say they weren't welcome. The youngest, no more than 12, was asleep, head resting against her sister's lap. She had a softness about her, a face still untouched by the world's cruelties, though her small hands were raw and red from the cold. For a long moment, Caleb simply stood there, towering in the doorway, his shadow falling over them. He was not used to surprises, and certainly not ones that looked this fragile. "What in God's name are you doing on my porch?" His voice came out deeper than intended, more growl than question. The eldest sister tightened her grip on the quilt. We didn't have anywhere else." Caleb narrowed his eyes. "Town's 10 miles south. Why didn't you stop there?" Her chin lifted, defiant despite the tremor in her voice. "Because they'd send us back." That gave him pause. "Back where?" She didn't answer. The middle sister spoke up instead, words quick and sharp. "Are you gonna let us freeze out here, or what? Big fella like you's got to have space inside." Caleb's jaw clenched. He didn't owe anyone shelter, not strangers who turned up uninvited, not when the world had taught him that company always carried a cost. Yet as he looked at them, their wet hair, their trembling shoulders, the youngest still asleep despite the chill, he felt something shift inside his chest, something he thought long buried. With a grunt, he stepped aside. "Get in, then. But don't touch nothing you don't understand." The sisters hesitated, then filed past him. The eldest guided the youngest gently over the threshold. The middle one looked him straight in the eye as she passed, as if testing how far his temper would stretch. Caleb shut the door behind them, sealing the storm out and, unknowingly, sealing something else in. Settling uneasy. Inside, the cabin was plain. Wooden floors scuffed from years of boots, a heavy stone fireplace cold from disuse, shelves lined with tools and ledgers, and a sturdy table scarred with knife marks. Caleb wasn't much for comfort. His home was more workshop than dwelling. The sisters clustered together near the stove, grateful for the heat radiating from the iron belly. Caleb watched them as he poured more water into the coffee pot. "Names," he said simply. The eldest straightened. "I'm Clara. This is June," she nodded toward the sharp-eyed middle sister, "and the little one is Maisie." Caleb gave a slow nod. "Boone. Caleb Boone." Maisie stirred then, blinking awake. She looked up at the giant with wide eyes, and instead of shrinking back as most children did, she smiled faintly. "You're tall," she murmured sleepily. Caleb blinked, startled by the simplicity of her words. He didn't know what to say, so he poured another cup of coffee instead. Clara spoke again, voice steady though her eyes betrayed her nerves. "We don't mean to trouble you, Mr. Boone. Just needed a dry place for the night. We'll be gone by morning." Caleb studied her. She was young, but her shoulders carried the weight of someone twice her age. Whatever they were running from, it was carved into her expression. "Storm's still heavy," he said gruffly. "Road'll be mud till midday. You'll stay till it clears." Clara exhaled, part relief, part tension. June, however, smirked. "Guess the giant ain't as mean as they say in town." Caleb's eyes snapped to hers. "Don't push me, girl." She only grinned wider, but she didn't speak again. The quiet shift. The rest of the morning passed in uneasy silence. Caleb went about his chores, feeding the stove, checking his ledgers, tightening a strap on his gear, while the sisters warmed themselves and whispered among each other. He tried not to listen, but snatches of conversation reached him nonetheless. "We can't go back. If they find us, Caleb Boone won't keep us long." Every word stirred more questions than answers. He wanted to demand the truth, but something held him back. He'd built his life on keeping others out, and yet these girls had arrived without warning, settled like sparrows under his eaves. By midday, the rain had eased. Sunlight broke through the clouds, glinting off the wet grass. Caleb saddled his horse to ride the fence-line, but before he left, Clara surprised him by standing. "Mr. Boone," she said, voice firm. "Thank you for letting us in. I know we're strangers, and I know you didn't ask for us. But you saved us more than you know." Caleb froze in the doorway, his massive frame outlined against the light. For a moment, he thought to send them away right then, to reclaim the silence that had been his only companion. But Maisie's small, trusting smile came back to him, and June's fierce eyes, and Clara's weary strength. He gave a single nod, then rode out. What he didn't see, as he disappeared into the hills, was how the sisters began to move through his cabin, not as guests planning to leave, but as if testing the corners of a place they might, just might, belong. And the town was ready to be shocked. What they did next. Caleb Boone had thought the sisters would be gone by the time the road dried. He'd pictured it plain. They'd thank him, walk south to Millstone, and disappear into the blur of faces he'd chosen never to know. But when he returned from the ridge that afternoon, saddle creaking, horse steaming from the climb, the girls were still there. Not only there, they were moving through his house as though it had always been theirs. The smallest shifts. The first thing he noticed was the smell. Instead of the acrid bite of burnt coffee and the stale tang of dust, the cabin carried the faint aroma of something warm, something sweet. Caleb stepped inside, frowning, and found Maisie crouched on a stool by the stove, humming softly while stirring a dented pot. Clara sat nearby, mending one of his torn shirts with thread she'd scavenged from who knows where. June, to his mild horror, was perched in his chair with her boots kicked up on the table, flipping through his ledgers as though she had every right. Caleb's brow furrowed. "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" June looked up with a smirk. "You call these books? Looks more like chicken scratch. Put it down." His voice rumbled like a warning storm. Clara gave her sister a sharp look. June rolled her eyes but set the ledger aside. Maisie, unfazed, lifted her spoon and said cheerfully, "We made stew." "Well, I tried. Clara says it's edible." Caleb opened his mouth to protest that they had no right, that this was his house and his food, but when the scent reached him fully, meat, potatoes, carrots softened into a broth, he realized it was the first real meal cooked in his cabin in years. He muttered something under his breath and went to wash at the basin. Meals and laughter. That night, they sat at the scarred oak table together. Caleb at one end, the sisters clustered at the other. The stew was simple, but it filled the silence with steam and comfort. Maisie talked between mouthfuls, telling stories about birds she'd seen on the trail and asking Caleb questions he'd long forgotten anyone might care about. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked innocently. Caleb froze with his spoon halfway to his mouth. "No," he said flatly. June snorted. "Figures. Man, like you wouldn't admit it if you did." Clara shot her a glare, but Caleb surprised them all by not snapping back. Instead, he lowered his spoon slowly and said, "Lonely's better than hurt." The table went quiet after that. Clara looked at him with an understanding that unsettled him, and Maisie reached across the table with her small hand, placing it gently against his enormous knuckles. "But lonely don't have to last forever," she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. But for the first time in years, he didn't eat alone. Whispers in town. By the end of the week, the town of Millstone was buzzing like a hive kicked over. "Boone's got women out at his place," muttered one ranch hand over whiskey at the saloon. "Not women, girls," corrected the barkeep. "3 of 'em. Sisters. Folks say they just showed up, and he took 'em in." The news spread faster than prairie fire. Some claimed he'd kidnapped them. Others whispered they must be orphans he was hiding for coin. A few even spun tales that Boone had finally gone mad and built himself a harem in the hills. The sheriff, a stout man named Willard Griggs, rode up one morning to see for himself. He found Clara splitting kindling neatly by the shed, June chasing chickens into a pen she'd patched herself, and Maisie feeding carrots to Boone's horse while the giant himself repaired a fence. "What's all this, Boone?" the sheriff asked cautiously. Caleb wiped sweat from his brow. 3 girls needed shelter. "They've got it." "That simple, huh?" "That simple." Griggs eyed the sisters. Clara met his gaze with steady defiance. June stuck her tongue out when Caleb's back was turned. Maisie waved cheerfully. The sheriff shook his head. "Whole town's riled. You best be careful, Boone. Folks don't like surprises." Caleb only grunted. But when Griggs rode away, he realized something startling. He cared, for the first time in years, what happened to someone else. The shocks begin. It didn't take long for the sisters to remake the ranch in ways Caleb hadn't expected. Clara was organized, practical, and quietly determined. She cleaned the tool shed, sorted his scattered papers, and even stitched curtains from old flour sacks. Caleb returned from riding the herd one evening to find the windows dressed in fabric that caught the golden sunset. He didn't say anything, but something in his chest softened. June was a whirlwind. She teased him mercilessly, called him Grizzly Boone, and insisted on riding his second horse even though she'd never been taught proper. Twice she nearly broke her neck, but by the 3rd week she was rounding up stray calves with a grin that made Caleb shake his head in reluctant admiration. Maisie was the light of the house. She left flowers in jars on the table, sang to the chickens, and filled every quiet space with laughter. When Caleb came in at dusk, bone-tired, she'd meet him with a smile so genuine it cracked the shell he'd worn for years. Neighbors who passed on the road began to whisper new tales. The giant wasn't just housing the sisters, he was changing. The confrontation. Not everyone was pleased. One Saturday, Caleb rode into Millstone for supplies. He tied his horse outside the general store, only to find a group of men waiting. Among them was Eli Carter, a rancher with more pride than sense. "Heard you got company, Boone," Eli said loudly, so everyone in earshot would hear. "3 strays on your porch. Folks are wondering what you're doing with them." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Ain't your concern." Eli stepped closer, smirking. "Girls don't just show up out of nowhere. Maybe you bought 'em. Maybe worse." The crowd murmured. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to break the man in half, but Clara's steady eyes flashed in his memory. "Don't let them see you as a brute." So instead, he said in a voice like stone, "Those girls work harder than any man I've hired. They're safer under my roof than they ever were on the road. You want to make trouble out of kindness, Carter, that's on you. But you best not speak their names again." Eli faltered under the weight of his stare. The crowd went silent. For the first time in years, Caleb had spoken not as a recluse, but as a man standing for something greater than himself. Word of that confrontation spread faster than the first rumor. And what shocked the town most wasn't that Boone had girls on his ranch, it was that he defended them like family. The truth of the sisters. It was Clara who finally told him the truth. They sat by the fire one evening, the girls asleep, the wind rattling the shutters. Caleb was mending tack when Clara spoke softly. "Our step-uncle, he wasn't kind. After Ma and Pa passed, he took us in for the land they left. He drank mean, hit meaner. I couldn't let Maisie grow up in that house. So we left. Been running near 2 months. Caleb set the leather strap down. He said nothing for a long moment, then simply asked, "And if he comes looking?" Clara's eyes met his. "Then we'll run again." Caleb leaned forward, voice low and certain. "Not while you're under my roof." The word surprised even him, but once spoken, he knew they were true. What they did next. The sisters didn't just live in his house, they filled it. They laughed where there had once been silence, sang where there had once been wind. They worked beside him in the fields, challenged him at the table, softened his hard edges without asking permission. The ending. Months passed. Spring crept across Hollow Creek. The ranch thrived in ways Caleb hadn't thought possible. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Clara stood beside him on the porch, arms folded, watching Maisie chase June across the yard. "You know," she said quietly, "you saved us that night." Caleb shook his head. "Other way around, Clara. You 3 saved me." And as the sisters laughed under the open sky, and as the once reclusive giant allowed himself to laugh with them, the truth settled over Hollow Creek. The world had thought Caleb Boone unshakable, untouchable, unreachable. But 3 sisters on his porch had proved them all wrong. And what they did next, what no one expected, was give the giant back his heart.